lecture organized by our master program in sustainable architecture and landscape design. This evening, we will have the opportunity to get to know closely the work and philosophy of one of the most interesting architectural practice on the Italian scene. It's Modus Architects, an architectural practice which was founded in 2000 in Bressanone by Sandy Attia, who is with us tonight, and Matteo Scagnol. Very few words. Sandy Attia was born in Cairo, in Egypt. She got her bachelor in University of Virginia, master at Harvard University, where she met Matteo Scagnol, who is co-founder of their studio. And she was, until 2004, professor at University of Michigan. The other associate is Matteo Scagnol, who was born in Trieste. For the foreign student, Trieste is a very interesting multicultural city, like a meeting place between Italian and Central European culture. He was educated in Venice and also got his education in Harvard. Their position in the international debate develops really between Italy and also other countries, mainly United States. As you will see this evening, Modus Architects tackles the projects at different scale, from infrastructures to building to object within the building, and include public, institutional, and private commissions. The practice stands out in the Italian and international panorama, combining the founding partners' two different cultural backgrounds into a very characterized approach to architectural design. What impresses me of their work is the ability to respond to specific and always different themes. Their portfolio is in this very exciting, with spatial and formal strategies of great suggestion. And they're also able somehow to generate always new figures in very complex and stratified context. And at the same time, they are also able to generate unexpected echoes with their history. Their work is very successful. They got really a lot of recognition. The list is quite long. I can just remember to you the honorable mention for the Medaglia d'Oro all'Architettura Italiana in 2012 and 2015, Eoderzo first prize, and also the first prize in the International Piranesi Award, and a special jury prize in the 2013 edition of the Italian Architecture of the Year Award. Somehow, I think their work was always very interesting in the way it was dealing with a specific physical context. Now they are somehow opening more their approach. The works which are really well known in the debate are basically all located in the South Tyrol region of Italy, like the Mountain Lodge in Lappago, the Psychiatric Center in Bolzano, the Bressanone-Varna Ring Road. But I don't want to do the list of all the works. I think at the end of the day, you should really visit their professional website. Now I could really say that the awards and the recognition have launched the practice on an international scale. I think definitely it is a practice which deserves to be closely monitored in the next years, as it promises further success for the future. So now I really thank our guest, Sandy Attia, and I give her the floor.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I must admit, this is the first time I do a formal presentation of our work remotely, even though I have been also teaching remotely. So hopefully all goes well. Anyhow, let's see. I would like to start by sharing my screen, for example. That might be good. And Does everyone see my screen?
Not yet, Sandy.
Oh, not yet.
Now, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to, of course, just touch base a little bit on our current situation. And I've been asked on various occasions recently to contribute to the COVID-19 debate, the kind of statement, a video, and admittedly, I haven't quite put myself out there yet and given some kind of profound statement of what we're in the midst of. Like many of you, I'm still processing and observing. And I imagine you, like me, have been watching how those from the fields of architecture and design have begun to design our post-COVID-19 future or present. And it's funny because I've been both kind of really fascinated and at times delighted, but also a little disturbed at the visions of this future and what our contribution can be. And so I thought that I would start with these two images. The image you see here is an image from the British Museum. It's one of the 100 objects that made it into a book that I really love titled A History of the World in 100 Objects. And this capacity to adapt, to invent, and to make tools that harness our surroundings to better our needs is what makes us human. It's what sets us apart. And so in many ways, our history as a humankind is very much allied to the tools that we make and the ways in which we adapt to our surroundings. So today, when we're presented with this necessity for physical distance between people, which, like I said, has kind of led to this dizzying array of solutions that reinvent the ways in which we interact with one another and the way in which we interface with objects and spaces, landscapes, built and unbuilt conditions. I wanted to go back to this idea of the tool and what this kind of means as a form of adaptation to architecture. So, and this is kind of different from some of the things that have been going on. You know, we can find, you can kind of start to see what's going on. You can find people are developing applications that can calibrate our proximities or feed us with information so as to model our behaviors. And these are certainly effective, let's say, measurable tools that help us to position ourselves in this kind of unforeseen territory. But perhaps as a kind of introduction to our work, what I find more interesting to dig into in our, I'm just calling it like our tool making capacity, is how these tools can serve our ideals as a collective. So ideals whose foundations are built upon the social and the cultural connotations of our work as architects. So to kind of keep that steadfast as a kind of unwavering constant. So in particular, I've been thinking about school closure and how we cannot lose sight of the role of schools and our educational institutions, what role they play as also cultural and social institutions. So with this in mind, I'd like to speak about 3 different types of projects, one of which is education, so schools, and the other 2 are tourism and health. And my idea was that to give you an idea of what we've done in the past and actually what we're working on right now in the office. So I was thinking to present 2 projects for tourism. So one that we have finished recently, so a built project, and something that we're working on now. And the same for education and health and so on and so forth. So starting with tourism, the first project that I'd like to talk about is a project that we've titled Treehugger. And it's a tourist information office in Bressanone, where we live here in South Tyrol. So here you see a first image of it. Everyone here, if you hear me okay. I'm going to assume that's a yes if no one says otherwise. So
It's fine.
Okay, and you see my mouse also? Do you see my mouse?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. So this is Bressanone. This is the medieval town of Bressanone. This is one of the landmark buildings, the Bishop's Palace, a new university, and the Bishop Garden. And these are the two main roads, this one and this one, that lead into Bressanone to go into the historical city center. And the site is right here. So it's literally just a sliver of a site. And just to give you an idea of what this context looks like, here's the university I was talking about. Here's the Bishop's Palace. This is the town of Bressanone, and our site is just hidden back in here. So, and that's what you see right on this site. So right as we see it from above, you see it with only trees. But as part of the project, it was a competition that we won. It was a two-phase invited competition, and we won it a couple of years ago, and we finished it last year. And we started looking a little bit at the history of the site. It's always been a site that was a place for welcoming visitors. There are many visitors that came to Bressanone because it was the seat of the bishop, and therefore there's the Bishop's Palace. And so through the centuries, there's been 3 different structures that we found were quite interesting to look at. And the first one was a loggia, so this kind of idea of an open but covered space. The second one in the 1930s, in the fascist period, also had a loggia and it had a kind of front with a second part, very kind of heavy construction. And this is a building from Otmar Barth, who's one of our most well-known local architects here, who has passed away in, I think, about 8 years ago. And it's a building of his from the 1970s. And what you see here is this stone wall that acts as a kind of separator between the two sides of the site. And the other thing you notice is how the trees have grown, and that the trees play an important role on the site. So we looked at the history of the site, and we began to start thinking of the site also as a place that had trees. That trees were part of the built context, which was something that we wanted to work with. And that the Bishop's Palace itself needed a kind of foreground that welcomed visitors. So with this being said, I'm going to show you a little bit in different slides about how we work. So some slides are really messy and they show kind of study models. This is the beginning of a study model. So where you see the site, you see the 1970s, the footprint of the 1970s building. This is the Bishop's Palace. And this is the project, how we submitted it to the competition. And what's interesting about this site also, not just about the kind of history of buildings that were subsequently demolished and rebuilt with the same kind of functions, is that with the Bishop's Palace, at the corners of the garden, there were these pavilions that were kind of exotic, let's say. And so this was the Chinese pavilion. And then the other corner was the so-called Japanese pavilion. And so we began to think about this visitor center as a pavilion, a kind of folly that had an other expression and a kind of otherness to it as an architectural vocabulary, this kind of exotic element that didn't try to fit in, let's say, with the kind of architecture, of course, of the Bishop's Palace, but more it was allied to these corner pavilions. So I just wanted to show you some images of the site so you kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. So here's the 1970s building. And like I said, we were interested in how to create a transparency, a connection across this sliver of a site, which, like I said, it's a very small site, it's a small building, but it's actually the entry to Bressanone where the 2 main roads come in. And that's the view that you see looking back on the site. So here you see a view on the right side would be the Bishop's Palace that you see reflected here in the glass. So we worked with a kind of glazed ground floor condition with a site with a building that hugged the existing tree and that stepped back from the site. And that's actually why we won the competition, because we created this public space here, a very small public space, but it's actually a really important public space. And we also provided a kind of cantilever, a loggia. So if it's raining or people are waiting for others or groups are kind of gathering, this has become a kind of meeting place. And so interacting with the existing built condition of the trees of the site. And so just to walk through the plan, you can enter through here and go upstairs. There's offices, which you see here. Or you can, the public goes in through this first entry area, and then the information booths where visitors and tourists can gather information are here. And there's other offices. There's also a spiral stair that leads up into the back offices and a kind of archive area. So here you see that in section, and this is all glazed on this ground floor, and it's a building that lifts itself off of the ground. This kind of levity of the building was something we were also interested in, looking at these existing buildings beforehand, how they had a kind of gracefulness to them, a kind of lightness. So we were looking at this folly that balanced this idea of gravity and lightness. So you see that here, this kind of transparency across the site with the large plane tree on the site. And you begin to see what these images look like. It's actually got, it's glazed below, it rises above, and it's got these big blank facades where it actually becomes an event space, and video projections are announce events in the city, and it becomes a kind of billboard, let's say, for what's going on in Bressanone. So I'll just go, and you see here how it kind of foregrounds the Bishop's Palace and starts to set up this dialogue also with the changing colors between, in autumn as with the colors of the facade, which is actually another study we did with this kind of relationship, this chromatic relationship to the historical context. Here you see a front view, a flat front view with the reflection of the Bishop's Palace, just to start to talk about that dialogue, and then how this building kind of hugs and wraps itself around this tree, so that this relationship between artifice and nature kind of come to one in this project. And what's interesting about this project, at least for us, it's the first time that we've done a project that is exposed concrete. And so that in itself was a new kind of tectonic that we were looking into. And we worked with the construction company to cast the concrete in sections in one pour from ground to the roof level, so that we didn't have a construction pour joints, horizontal pour joints. And this was done, so it was like a vase, like this empty shell, and 9 meters high, that of course had to be reinforced and had to be kept in place until it hardened. And then the floor was cast into this open shell. So it's a kind of logic that we had never usually, you pour your first floor, and then you pour the walls of the ground floor, and then your horizontal slab, and so on and so forth. Whereas this was actually really interesting to really think about how the convex and concave lines of the walls work to reinforce this structure, to form a kind of structural band, and sort of curve and sway around this tree. And it was really fascinating to collaborate with the construction company to work on all the formwork and the kind of odd geometries that came out of this. In constructing here, you see a piece of one of the apertures, this kind of strange apertures that look out across to the Bishop's Palace. So that's a view during construction. And also this is the formwork that we used to pour the spiral stair, that within which then there was a spiral stair that was placed within the concrete core, which was that secondary vertical circulation. The concrete is a bush hammered concrete, and that too, you can see someone working here. You can see the size of the machine. It's very small in relationship to the surface of the facade, and it's just an incredibly arduous job to do. But they do usually have larger machines that that treat the surface of this facade. However, seeing that all of the surfaces were slightly curved, they had to work with a smaller machine. So this was actually an incredibly complex effect to achieve with this surface. But we were really interested in bringing out a kind of depth to the surface and bringing out the kind of aggregate of the concrete, so that the surface of the do you hear me okay? Saying I have bad network quality. Anyway.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
It's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So you see the surface of the tourism center facade and the surface of the plane tree are kind of in dialogue, with the bark kind of flaking and that kind of textured the textured surface of the bush hammered concrete. And again, that relationship, that very close relationship between this other figure that's put before at the feet of the bishop's palace. So I'll just run through a series of slides that give you this idea of that dialogue horizontally across the site, so that as the two roads come in, the tourist information center as a building acts as a pivot point, as a connection point rather than as a separation point. And we did all of the furnishing within the interiors. So we were looking at the interplay of a more polished surface with Olmo is elmwood, I believe, with elmwood wood finishing, and there's this interplay of these more structural metal elements that talk about this cantilever, the kind of structure of the building itself. We were also looking to work with those ideas at the furniture scale. So a few detail images. And this is when you enter into the building with the first entryway, and then you have a view looking down the information booths. And then that's looking back the other way towards the city center. So with that, I'd like to go to the second project, which is a project called Hotel Ocurro. And this project is something, it was also a competition, so a privately organized competition by a family who has been running now the hotel for 3 generations on Alpe di Siusi, which is a beautiful heritage site in South Tyrol, about an hour from where we live. And we presented the project.
Sandy, as far as we have some connection problem, maybe you can switch on your camera. That maybe is better for.
Oh, switch it off?
Switch off just the camera. Your camera, and you can share the video without your camera.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so with Hotel Ocurro, it's the daughter. So this is a 3rd generation. She was interested in renovating the hotel, giving it a kind of facelift. So she was looking for an idea of a facade, but she was also looking to increase the number of rooms and give a higher quality, a more specific cut feel to the hotel than what is the existing condition of the hotel. So it's a hotel. So this is the site. So it's a completely very breathtaking site, very beautiful. It's a place that's loved during summer and winter for hiking in the summer, and in the winter skiing. You can see the ski lift that passes right behind it, and then when you're skiing, you ski right in front of it. So it's positioned between these two kind of infrastructures. And so we were looking to work with wood as a facade to give it a character that gave it a kind of thickness, and using the tectonics of wood to work with a facade that pulled together the various elements of the project, because building has been added onto little by little over the years. And as a whole, I think I have an image of it. Yeah, as a whole, you can see it here. So the original structure, well, I'll show you what the original structure was, but this is the original you can see the first part of the building that was then added onto, and then added onto again, and then added onto again. And so this kind of cacophony of volumes that then were sort of crowned by these gabled roofs that were looking to tie into the tradition, the South Tyrol tradition of wood building and the gabled roof and so on and so forth. We were looking to understand a little more specifically what is the history of this building and what does it mean to build at the top of a plateau on a World Heritage site. So it's a very delicate situation in terms of landscape. So digging through a little bit of the archives, we found this is what the building looked like when it was originally a mountain lodge, let's say, so not a hotel. And we were interested in how it had this very clear base, which you see on the right, a very compact volume, and then this one slope roof that had this had this overhang. And that kind of clarity, that volumetric clarity, was something that we were looking to give to a project that had this, kind of confused, ad hoc, somewhat dated image to it, which was a shame with this incredible backdrop to this landscape. So I'm going to show you a series of ugly models just to give you an idea of how we start working really quickly, a lot in model without any specific drawings perhaps yet. And so first we model the and trying to understand, the slope of things and what we could do with that if we could start working with the roof of the main volume itself, but still keep the gables, because that was something that the parents of the daughter who's now kind of in charge, they were reluctant to let go of. And we are really interested in how to find how to use the element of the roof as a unifying element. And so here you start to see some of the study models that we were working on, trying to figure out how gable and one slanted roof could come together, which it didn't work out. And so we went, as you saw before, working with these structural elements, because this is what helps hold down the roof so it's not blown away, and gives this kind of tree quality, let's call it a tree quality, to the facade, and that can bring together all of the balconies and all of the kind of strange little protrusions and insets that the building go into to have a very clear line and create a new image for this hotel. So I'll just go through a series. This is one of the earlier models that we worked with, which then in a second phase of the competition, the client, they asked two of us, the other office, I think was Snoetta, two of us to go back and rework the facade. They weren't so sure about having one really large facade with our submission, and they thought, no, we're more interested in giving more privacy to the room. So we tried working on that in a number of ways, which you see here in sketch and then in kind of digitally modeled. And so that's where we're at now with this project. Actually, we went back to our original facade with the wooden elements, and that's what we're working on now. And then we started to work on the interiors. She was, her name is Angelica Sattler. She actually organized, she wasn't sure if she wanted to also work with us for the interiors, which, when you work on a hotel, of course, the interiors are very important. And we've actually only done one other very small hotel. So she was, wondering who else out there is maybe more expertise in hotels. And so we really wanted to come up with an idea of a room that had a very clear concept that was that made a meeting point between the architecture and the interiors, and that they weren't two separate things, which in hotels, it's actually not that easy. It's not that easy to develop because there's this kind of formula that a lot of rooms have to follow. So we proposed the Monocular room. And going back to this kind of dreamy, mythical landscape that we're in, we came up with a statement that no landscape exists without an observer. So the role of the individual, the role of the visitor, the role of the tourist is what activates the landscape, and the space through which the observer, the tourist, moves is what gives access or frames the landscape. So with this idea, we started looking at kind of what's going on today, the trends in hotel design for the rooms. And there's, the more beautiful or less successful, or I mean, there's 1,000 ways that people have kind of swung the hotel room. If you had to diagram it, it's basically you enter, there's the bathroom, and then there's the room. Okay, and this could be more or less fragmented, so you don't have them as such separate spaces, but generally, to simplify, that's kind of the standard room. And we were interested in transforming this room into an observatory of the landscape. And the hotel room would become a kind of telescope. When you would enter into this room, you would be telescoped out into this view. And that experience is what gave you refuge. And that, which is it's kind of the branding of the hotel, this term refugium, which means refuge, which it's, not something entirely new, but something that they're really developing on every level of the concept of the hotel. And so we looked at 2 different floor plans, looking at what's kind of going on now in hotel room design, where you have this kind of fragmentation of the various spaces, and each space has its own function. But in any case, there's still this idea of the entry area and the room proper, and then you have your balcony. So we were interested, like I said, of creating this space, which was this telescoped experience, and that all of the service spaces were very special and hidden, so not in plain sight. So kind of working in counterintuitively, let's say, with the trends in hotel design, where things are more transparent, so someone who's taking a shower can see who's in bed, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to show you a quick video, and unfortunately I have to exit because we tried it before in the video. And also the other unfortunate thing, I'll show you a quick video just to give you, this is because we presented all this through Zoom, so remotely. And so we were trying to find a way to capture the client's kind of imagination, but still be able to talk about texture and tactile qualities. So here we're entering into the room, and we have that view. And that's the kind of first experience that you see as you walk into the room. I apologize about being crooked. And then as you move into it,
Sandy, I guess it's not working, the video. I can see just the stop images.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I'll go back to the...
We have to work about it. Teams sounds not adapted to see video together.
No problem. Okay, so let's go forward. So here I have a few snapshots of the room. So when you enter, you have, of course, where you hang up the clothes, and then you can kind of get a glimpse of this very special shower. So this is the kind of experience of water in your hotel. You have the niche for the sink, and then this is the space for the most private space for the toilet, and which you see here, which was all modeled. And this is all part of that hidden experience, let's say, of this slanted wall that creates that telescope experience. And so here you see the whole model. And then you saw that this is a kind of stop show of what the video was and how entering into the room, what kind of experience that is, and that kind of telescopic view. So with that being said, I wanted to move on. Let me look at time a minute. Okay, so I wanted to look a little bit at 2 school projects. And
Sandy, I guess the presentation is stopped. We are still in the 2 hotels views.
Okay.
At least my also Sarah, also for you.
Yes, maybe you can unshare your screen and then share it again.
Sure.
Usually fixes the...
Okay. Do you guys see my screen?
Yeah. Now maybe you're not. Now you are not in your screen. Try to share it.
Do you see it?
Just one. Now, yes.
Okay.
Now we are in Firmian. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if the slide goes on. Does it go forward?
Yes, it works.
Okay. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, schools are a very big topic. I've done some research with an educationalist. I've done a number of case studies on schools, and as a studio, we've built 8 schools, and we're very interested. Well, we've become very interested. In the beginning, we weren't that interested because we didn't know about. It's kind of this interest that's come out of experience about the relationship between educational spaces and innovative learning, and how intertwined they are, and how each one has its own autonomy. But when they meet in education, in school buildings, they have a direct effect on each other. So it's really, really important, this dialogue between. So this project is at it's a competition that we won. It's the second competition we won. So I think in like 2003 or 4, I don't quite remember. And it was a very big project. It's the first big project that we won as a competition and started to build, and it was 20 million euros. So for us, that was just 2 years after graduating from Harvard, and it was an incredible experience. And it was the heart of a new neighborhood in Bolzano. So it was a new piece of the city that was being built and planned. And the heart of that was dedicated to a school complex. So it had like this really civic weightiness to it. And this is a really hard image to read, but this is the area. It's called Firmiano. And these are the 2 buildings. So the competition was for Polo dell'Infanzia, so a building that was for the younger kids, so nursery, kindergarten, and a family center. And then the other building was for elementary school, middle school, and a branch library. And in the end, we didn't do the middle school, so it's just elementary school and a library, as well as the piazza, the public square. And so we had to follow the urban planning of this neighborhood, and in the description and kind of codified within the language of this urban plan, there was this idea of a curvilinear kind of profile to the site on the right, and a more rectilinear profile on the left. And we were really interested in having this dialogue between something that was more of a free form and something that kind of followed a very linear geometric 90-degree vocabulary, let's say. And the other thing that's important with schools, which especially in today's climate of social distancing or physical distancing, is that schools are incredibly dense environments. A lot of things happen in them. So this was an incredibly dense program, and it was a school that had to have a certain civic quality to it, that we were interested in activating it as a school that worked not 24/7, but that other activities were taking place as the heart and center of the new neighborhood in the evenings with classes, and also during the summers, that these became active buildings and not simply silent because they were no longer places of learning. So with that being said, so this is the complex for the younger children, and I'm going to focus more specifically on this building for the elementary school. But I wanted to talk about this building because it was very formative for us to understand the culture of schools, teaching, head teachers, the whole kind of teaching community, and the rules and regulations that govern schools. And architecturally, we began to really look at this relationship between something that kind of had a, let's say, organic quality to it, and that it was also more interior for the smaller children, and something that was reaching out into the landscape and back towards the city with the elementary school. And so working with if you look at this ground floor, all of the most public spaces are at the ground floor. So you have the public library, you have the auditorium, you have the Mensa, the cafeteria, you have a very big grand hall, which is in relationship to a smaller kind of public square, and you have the gym. And all of these could be accessible in the evenings without giving access to the schools above, to the classrooms above. And now, 15 years later, these seems like very obvious decisions, but actually it was a very long process for us to arrive at this and kind of build consensus around this project, so that that sense of community was actually placed. One thing architecturally, it's another thing to have engaged the community in such a way that these buildings are activated in the long term. So I'm going to show you a number of images. First is kind of comparing, giving you an idea of what these two buildings look like. So on the right is the a building for the younger kids, on the left for the elementary school. And so this gives you an idea of the kind of governing geometries of the more curvilinear building and its relationship to this orthogonal grid that we were working with on the other building. And so again, these are for the smaller kids. And then this is the square with the entry to the school, and this is the entry to the library. With this is the music hall and dining in the drawing room that look out back towards the city. There's a kind of urban access that this references. So this is when you enter into the school, this is the library. So you're here looking back into the library, and this is the space that you enter into. So to give, to confer a kind of dignity and a kind of sense of civic pride to these spaces of the library, the spaces that are open to the community, and working with an architecture that has a kind of robustness to it. These are clinker, they're German bricks that have this kind of reflective quality to them when the light hits them, but at the ground level, working with this transparency so that you can see across the building and the various functions along the way. So here we're on the other side of the piazza of the school courtyard with the auditorium. So this is the entry hall, and on the right would be the cafeteria. And then as you enter into the school, you get glimpses down into the gym. And this is the entry hall. So it straddles, it's a kind of bridge between the city and the countryside, because we're at that edge of the city. And as you move up to the first floor, working with these double height spaces to facilitate and foster a sense of community within the school, transparency as an architectural element is really important in schools. They talk about it a lot, and in this idea of fostering community. At first, I wasn't sure what that meant, but being able to see means being able to engage and see others who are doing other activities. And that's what begins to bring people together within a school. So if you think about sitting in a classroom with a closed door, you have no idea what's going on outside of that classroom. And that kind of segmentation of time, of activities and physical space is something that more innovative practices in schools are looking to do away with. And so this is an early project where that idea of informal learning spaces was still kind of really in its nascent stages. And so the school has, in any case, a corridor with classrooms off of it, but we were looking to try and activate the common spaces and these kind of breakout spaces as informal places that students could also gather, and that's how they use it today. These have become very important spaces, and these doors between these classrooms always remain open, and they form a kind of cluster. Using very kind of robust materials, schools, take a lot of wear and tear. And one of the other topics we're interested in is the relationship between structure and the architecture itself, and how these two come together to form a number of outdoor spaces. So for covered outdoor spaces in schools are actually really important. It makes a big difference if you have a break and it's raining and you can still go outside. That completely changes the day for kids at school. And so this building offers a really bold kind of volume, stereometric volume to it, but that it's a kind of lifting itself off of the ground and giving it over to the students, so that they can play all year round and be able to see people in the cafeteria, what's going on in the auditorium. There's a kind of this very active ground floor at the school. And these lessons, along with a number of, I'm going to present, I'll present the Shaloya building, and then you guys let me know if I should stop. Okay, so we'll decide after the Shaloya school complex. So this is a competition that we just turned in preliminary competition that we won last fall, I think in November. And it's kind of the synthesis of all these years of working on schools that came together with a project that we were really interested in, bringing ideas of the school as a place to requalify a neighborhood and as a place of learning, but as a very social space. So this is one of an early sketch of the site. It's a very long, thin site in a more peripheral location of Milan. And what's really important about this site is that there's a very large road here, but it's the beginning of Parco Nord. It's the beginning of a very important large green space for Milan. And so we were looking at this kind of linear condition and to give it a kind of meandering, informal quality to it, so that you could walk along traverse the entire site and encounter buildings that were of the same kind, but didn't have a kind of direct approach to them. So you could kind of meander through these buildings as you walked along the length of the site. So this is a landscape diagram. We worked with ProApp, with João Nunes on this competition, a landscape architect from Portugal. And what was really clear in his diagram of this site is that there's two forces on the site. There's the relationship to the park and needing to also acoustically protect this side of the site from the noise of the cars and create a series of relationships with the neighborhood. But what's important is that there's no front and back. There's two different fronts. And so each of these buildings it's like a series of archipelagos that kind of meander through the length of the site. So here are some diagrams that talk about this relationship, like as you see, so this is the entire site. And as you see, this is the beginning of Parco Nord, which is part of a master plan landscape scheme for the city of Milan, where they have this green belt, and then they have these radial green corridors that reach out into this green belt. And so this is one of those radial corridors, and we're at the intersection with the green belt, which is marked by by the Parco Nord. So this presence of green was something very important to the site. So we were looking to considering the school intervention. It's a school complex for kids from 0, so really small kids all the way through middle school. And there was supposed to be also a public library, a sports center, and an auditorium that was open to the public. So again, those functions that we saw in Resia that we had worked on 15 years ago, and with all this kind of baggage of experience of schools, we really felt like we were ready to take on a project, let's say, of a larger scale than what we had been working on to date in South Tyrol. So I'm just going to show you a series of images that talk about these functions. We worked very kind of directly saying, okay, let's organize the age groups so that the small kids start here, and there's a kind of continuity of their education, and they go from the nursery school to the kindergarten, the nursery school to the kindergarten, interrupted by this access of the community center, which is comprised of the library and the auditorium. And then this is the elementary school, the middle school, and the sports complex. And in addition to these school buildings, we were asked to develop a series of urban guidelines that provided a safe corridor for access from the neighborhood to the new school complex, as well as the design of a park, where on this site is, I think, I don't remember if it's the kindergarten or the nursery school, now for the city of Milan, and that's going to be demolished, made into a park, and so that building is going to be transferred onto this site. So you have the whole age group of obligatory school, let's say. So here we have an image of that, and we were interested in reclaiming the roofs of these and coming up with the roofs as a series of gardens, and creating these spaces, these kind of threshold spaces where the public could find gathering spaces, these very public areas, a kind of public square, a piazza, which is where all the entryways to the various schools are given access to. And so working with ProApp, this is the kind of green acoustic wall that we developed with them. And these are a series of threshold spaces which delineated the beginning and the end, where the property of the school proper started, and the kind of public space, while still having an interface, because the competition brief asked for a double wall of the entire site around the school complex. So we were really interested in trying to break down that the school complex is a kind of island isolated from its environment, from its community, and trying to find safe ways that we could delineate a public interface with the school and promote it as a civic engager within the site. So here you see that in plan, and this concept of the site intervention is also taken down to the scale of the buildings. So here you see, for example, an image of the kindergarten, of the elementary school, and they're based around a courtyard. So it gives light to all the spaces, and it creates a series of informal learning spaces. This is the access to the library, the elementary and middle school. And we started working with a series of kind of taxonomy of furnishings that acted as, in the kind of language of Herzberger, a language of thresholds, of pinpoints, transition points, where furniture, the scale of furniture and the scale of architecture meet and have a direct influence on what kind of learning takes place. So learning for many, learning for a few, quiet learning, social engagement, and so on and so forth. And that transferred onto also a taxonomy of informal learning settings. So with this final slide, otherwise I think I'll really go on too long. Or what do you think, Michele?
No, Sandy, I guess if you want, it's okay for you, you can go on also with the other two projects about health that I guess is very topical for our moment, and
okay.
It's fantastic for us. It's okay for you.
Of course, no. If I'm not, if everybody's still on board, of course. Okay, so talking about health. So this is actually, it's a psychiatric rehabilitation center located in Bolzano, and it's officially the first competition that we won. And it's a project that it took 10 years to build, because so it had a very difficult process. And because when we won the competition, it was a competition that the client was both the city of Bolzano and the province of Bolzano, and they had come together to in an important residential neighborhood in Bolzano, and this is a key point. They had come together to put out a brief for an elderly housing, an an old people's home, and a kindergarten and a day center. So it was a very strange hybrid of programs, and for a series of reasons, all kinds of things happened, and then it became evident that the city really needed to move the current psychiatric rehabilitation center, which is actually quite nearby, from a building that was not up to code and had a series of problems. They needed to build a new psychiatric center, and this, of course, was received at the time with mixed reviews by the residents, because it's, like I said, it's a residential neighborhood. But so I'll come back to that. But in terms of the architecture of the site, we were interested in one of the topics that we work with often is this idea of two-ness. Two is in the number 2, 1, 2, like how two things come together, which seems really simple, but it's actually out of something very simple, how two things come together. If there's two volumes or two concepts or two programs, some third element can come out, and that third element is hopefully an added value to the project. And so with the psychiatric center, we were looking first of all to come up with an architecture that did not say, I am a hospital, I am a mental, psychiatric institution. And the lead psychiatrist, the doctor who was our contact person throughout the whole project, throughout the whole 10 years, was very clear on the role of these psychiatric centers as how to integrate them better into the community, because that's absolutely essential. It's like their core mission, and that they're open door institutions. So their doors are always open. People can come in and go out as they please, and that it's a residential building. So people live there. And with that being said, we're in Bolzano, in this residential neighborhood at the foothills of the mountains. And this is the site that you see here. This is the building. So these two volumes that break away from each other and form two courtyards. So there's this kind of idea of different kinds of open public, semi-public spaces. And in plan, it's actually very simple. These psychiatric buildings are divided into units. So you'll have 12 bed units, and you might have, and that 12 beds that comprises one unit, and then each of these units has its own living room and kitchen and a nurse station. So this has 3 of those units, and we were looking to this relationship of creating a public space at the ground level, which is open to the street, where people could sit outside, and that's where you enter. So it creates like this sheltered environment. Here you see an image of that. And to come up with an architecture that also had a residential scale to it. So really working with the idea of the window and in dialogue with the other residential buildings around it. So here are a few images of that. And here is one of the courtyards that you saw from above. And there's this idea of the circulation that it's really important for the residents to be able to wander and be able to walk around. And so there's no dead ends in this building, so you can walk around, go up and down. It's kind of integrated this idea of movement and this being able to look across and feel part of this community with this architecture of bridges, let's say. And structurally, it's really important because at the entryway, there's a 7-meter cantilever, and these bridges are actually structural, and that's what's holding the two buildings together. So like I said, we're also, really interested in the relationship, how structure is one of our tools also as architects, and how to engage that as part of the architectural conception of the project. So here you see some of the laboratory spaces. And these, of course, are images that were taken before the building was occupied, so they look really empty. This is where it's a visitor's room. So when you go to visit one of the residents, this is one of the rooms that you can meet up with. These are the hallways that are always lit in relationship to outdoor spaces. And this is an image of one of the rooms. So kind of very playful, colorful places. Some of these rooms are people who are going to stay here for a very long time. Some are, the ambition is that it's a rehabilitation center. So they're only here for a short period of time, and they're able to be integrated, let's say, back into society. And that idea of integration is what makes there's an alliance between these psychiatric rehabilitation centers and schools, because they're considered places of schooling for life skills, occupational therapy, and so on and so forth. Are actually there's a kind of didactic dimension to these buildings, which is actually very interesting. And so there's a lot of crossovers, let's say, between educational spaces and spaces for some of these more marginalized or more fragile people in our communities. Is a kind of topic, you know, they're not so far apart from each other. This is actually just the library for the doctors who work in the building. So one of the buildings that we're working on now is an adult day hospital. So there are people with both who are both physically and mentally differently abled. And so this is a project that we started working on 2 years with the province of Bolzano, and it has been put on hold until just recently. And it's in a very difficult site, which I think is really important as a kind of first gesture, because it's considered, it's got a low budget. We had to put a lot of program into a very small, again, it's kind of sliver of a site, and in a condition that's actually rather tall buildings. And the program, we had a height restriction of just 4 floors. And so working with this in the site plan, you see a very compact footprint. These are all the high-rise, let's say for Bolzano, high-rise buildings around it. There's a network of streets that's very prominent, as well as these elevated roads and walkways. So it's a kind of convoluted site. And we were working with a very compact form to give it a kind of skin and thickness so that it can kind of hold its own in this urban environment. So here you see this section, the long section, again, working with these cantilevers that mark the entry and mark a kind of social space for the resident. They're not residents, for the people coming to visit the structure. They come here to socialize and to gain life skills, and it's also organized into different units, but I won't get into that. So I actually don't have that much information on this project because, as I said, it's been on hold, and now we're just getting back into it. Here's looking at the skin of this building. It's kind of a hard building, but we were looking to make it like a sponge so that you could have outdoor spaces but still be screened. So this kind of thickened skin that acts as a brise-soleil, but act as a filter also for privacy reasons. So that is my last slide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandy. Well, it's the moment of applause. I don't know the virtual applause, how it can be. Well, thank you also from my side, from Sarah, for this very deep presentations. We like also, because these moments are also way to test that you can also go outside. So I'm a bit angry with you because you remember me about Alpe di Siusi, skiing and so on. And this sounds very far from what we can do in this moment, but it's just a few months. Now we have some minutes to maybe you can also stop your sharing so we can
Yes.
see your face. We have some minutes for a final discussion and comments. We are collecting in the chat the discussion, and so I had prepared some questions, but I prefer to give the floor to the students. For example, one very topical question is by Fernando Torres. He said, well, thank you very much for the presentation. The projects are very interesting. And he has a question regarding the shapes of the building itself. He wrote, even though many of them, of your project, seems somehow as individual objects in the context, they have a very clear relation with the context itself. So the views, the replacement, in the relation with the heritage, the free ground floor, and so on. Is the question that is the topical question is there a process that you follow to get the shape, the final shape?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, and it's a question that we talk about with a lot with the students. So let me just talk to it. Let me just talk about this from, let's say, as teaching a design studio. There's kind of two schools of thoughts from my teaching in the States. There's one where when I went to school, there was this idea that when you start designing, you go to the site and you do a kind of site analysis, and from the site you gain the architecture comes to you. Okay, let's say, because through your analysis of the site conditions and the cultural and social conditions and so on and so forth, the architecture can respond to those. And then there's the other one, which I found is actually gaining a lot more traction, at least with my minimal exposure to teaching in the States, is that actually the site gives you no answer. And that, you know, like Le Corbusier, who said he had a project in his pocket, and then he went to the site, and that project and the site come together. And so the question is, if it doesn't come from the site, where does it come from? Right? Yeah. And so that's the big mystery of architecture, and that's you know, how you teach it, you know, because there's no right and wrong. If it's not coming from the site, or maybe it's also partially coming from the site, where does it come from? And so then there was this big discussion about, oh, it's so formal, it's just formalism, as being has empty container, has no content, because where does that content come from? I'm taking this from a very long view, but it's a good question, because where do our forms come from? Where do our forms come from? You know, the thing about our work that a lot of people say is that, gosh, you know, I would have never imagined, I didn't know that you guys also designed that building. You know, I don't know what it might be, if it's like the Costner building, the 2 wooden volumes, and you know, the Resia school project, because they look formally and materially, they're very different. And I think for us, there's a kind of curiosity in the way we work, or in general, how architects work. You know, you don't want to get bored, and as students, you know that very well. And so there's this kind of constant research into finding ways in which same idea can have different architectural vocabularies. And part of what happens is also the tools with which you work. So talking about tools, and we work a lot in model, physical model. So I think that, of course, has an inflection on the kind of work that you produce. So if you work in drawing, perhaps it's a little less, I don't want to use the word sculptural, but let's just call it sculptural. It's a little less free, maybe, in the way that you come up with forms. But a lot of times, you know, the topics that we're interested in are really basic topics, like, you know, the connection to the ground and the sky, or how the idea of 2 or hybrid programs, the relationship to structure, a kind of tectonic expression. I mean, really, you know, architecture 101. And so, yeah, how do you find form? A lot of it is...
Yeah, no, you have started your lecture with a word, adaptation. So maybe we can also say, by a methodological point of view, it's quite strange that all the questions are about methods. And it comes from an adaptation that is not just a question of going from one point to the other, but it's a question of different step of double adaptation. So it's true what the students was stressing, in my view, also in the first project for the tourist office in Bressanone in Brix. It is a question of how the architecture is going towards the landscape and the opposite. And so the uses is influencing the landscape, and the landscape is influencing the uses. There is another question about methods, by Salma. Well, thank you very much for this extraordinary presentation. Instead, she focuses about the choices of material. For the school project, you explained that where you choosing the first project for Firmian, where you choose the reflective bricks to be in dialogue with the urban context. How do you find so matching materials? How is the process of decision making regarding texture and skin?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you know, the bricks actually they're not, let's just say here in South Tyrol, bricks are kind of allied to fascist architecture. And there was actually a huge discussion that came out of the use of brick. And there was a lot of resistance of using brick. But the idea, I find that a lot of times there's a very organic relationship between architectural ideas, materials, and form, and the way they react to the way they not react to the context, but they kind of put themselves on the table in relationship to the context. And so materials are one of the many choices and tools that we have as architects. And it's an important choice. So each project has its own set of variables and conditions. And with schools, which I think are really, what's really important is that they need to last a long time. And they need to have a certain durability. And that kind of durability is something that we've been interested in materials. So durability not only in their in how long they last, but also in their weightiness, and also in this idea of monomateriality, the kind of unified qualities that they give. So how do we work with materials? I mean, a lot of time it's always like, oh gosh, you know, let's not do another building in plaster. What if we worked with this material? And of course, it's always a risk because you don't know the detailing, you don't know who's going to supply it, you don't know what the effects are on long term. But that's the kind of adventure and the joy also of our profession. Because different materials speak. They react to the elements and weather and in different ways. And that chemistry between environment and architecture is a whole nother dimension that us as architects, we can investigate. So it's also something we're really interested in.
Okay. Still about fascinating from shapes and material, Maïs asked you something about Alpe di Siusi hotels. So we need to visit it in the next winter. Now, I have noticed the shape of windows. You have talked about it. It's really fascinating. Is there a concept of having them like this? Where does this choice come from? You have said something about a tree, this idea of trees.
Yeah, I mean, of course, in South Tyrol, in general, I mean, wood is an amazing material. Of course, in terms of just at the topic of sustainability, it's a material that's going to gain traction at an accelerated pace. Wood is also a local material. It has a history of building, has a tectonic history here in South Tyrol, but not only there's a kind of maestranza, there's a knowledge and know-how of building with wood. And these are all very important because wood in and of itself and how you use it, it gives identity, it gives place, and it talks to the local community. And so for all of these reasons, also the other thing about wood is that it's extremely malleable. It's very pliable. I mean, in terms of design, how you work with it, you can cut it into all kinds of crazy shapes. It comes in all kinds of different dimensions. You can make it massive. You can make it really light. And all those qualities about wood are it weathers, you know, and how it weathers. They're actually really beautiful. In Alpe di Siusi, of course, the natural condition is very powerful. And so actually when you see the existing hotel of Hotel Ocurro, it looks just like a tiny kind of insignificant thing on the plateau. And the kind of simple construction of the past somehow is able to hold its own in the past of that particular project. That you know how I showed you that image of the first construction of the Ocurro project, that kind of simple construction with the wooden roof. There was something about that spoke to us in trying to find a new facade that is also structural, that also creates a rhythm, because, you know, with hotels, that's how do you make, what are you going to do with that rhythm of that's the big issue.
Reality.
The unit, the mystery, the unit to the whole. And so with wood, we found that, you know, was a good, let's say, selling point also for the client who was interested in giving it a new face. So wood seemed like a material that could answer a lot of different questions.
Instead, Maya is mainly interested in the structural impacts of your project. So I appreciate your notation on the structural aspect in correspondence also with the sustainability. But she's very fascinated by the large span you have presented in the Firmian school. I want to ask how the structural system of that part was designed.
Yeah, you know, that's
you had to fight a lot with the engineer, I guess.
Yeah, we're always saying, no, you don't need that much steel, you don't need that much steel. But we've seen how buildings deflect with time. And so we understand that engineers, you work with them, not against them. But how that works is that the entire volume above the cantilever, those walls are beams, just in the most simple way. And so if the walls are acting like beams, you know, it's a whole beam, then that's what's keeping it from tipping over.
Okay. Instead, you have now I'm reading together with you. From Tan, thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate your project. My question is, as an architect from Cairo, if I'm not mistaken, I trained in America. I'm working mostly in Europe or in Alto Adige, which is a part of Italy. Do you find any challenges or specific differences that you want to share? Do you have any advice for us, for them, mostly international students from different parts of the world, in terms of this internationalization and the exchanging of experiences?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a little bit about my background, because I think it's important to a certain degree just to explain. I mean, not for me, because my mother's American, my father's Egyptian. I was born in Cairo, but I grew up in Kuwait. So I grew up in the Gulf Arab world, where I lived as an expatriate, and I went to a British school, not an American school. And I lived there until the war, and then I was displaced, and I went to the States. I went to my last year of high school, and I did all of my university in the States. And then from there, I moved to Egypt, and then I ended up in Italy because I met Matteo, and I followed him here, and we started our own practice. So what I find fascinating is that, you know, in which for a long time for me as a teenager and all this stuff was a problem of like, you know, what is my identity? Where are my roots? So, you know, what is my culture? And how can architecture be an expression of my culture as a part of a larger culture? You know, what is that relationship? And I think, I mean, and this is important also for the fact I'm not working in Italy per se, I am, but I'm working specifically in South Tyrol. And what is it that kind of distinguishes us from other offices in South Tyrol is that we're not from here. And that kind of otherness actually gives us a freedom. I don't have the baggage of a kind of a connection to a certain culture and traditions and a kind of history with this immediate context. And so that is actually what gives me a freedom. It gives me a different perspective as an architect and as a person. And I think that that is the culture that we live in today. So we're all citizens. You know, it sounds very trite, but we're all citizens of the world, and our contributions depend on where we are and who we are, but it's not because we're from there. You know, that notion of being from a place and staying there, it's very far removed from the reality for a lot of people. And so I think I find it fascinating people who, you know, there's lots of people I know here who are from South Tyrol. They're born here, they grew up here, they work here, they raised their children here. And I find that so fascinating. And so that's maybe why also when I approach projects, there's a kind of research element to it. You know, what is it about space or certain buildings, you know, like a mountain lodge up at, 2,500 feet. What is it about that in terms of its architecture? What does it say to people? What does it mean, you know? And maybe if you're from here, you have a different response to that, you know? And so as architects, that's what keeps us on our toes, that kind of otherness, you know, part of a global, let's say, community.
Okay, you have talked about South Tyrol. Another question is by Ricardo, because Ricardo is our colleague. He presented a very long question because he like to talk very much. He said that he sometime go to South Tyrol because of visiting Klimahaus and so on, but he has visited also the psychiatric center in Bolzano. He appreciated a lot. The question is about exactly what you were talking about South Tyrol, this special identity situation. And he asks comments about how, in your opinion, can we find there a specific quality of contemporary architecture that sounds quite different from other parts of Italy, also other parts of Europe?
Yeah, it's an important question. One is governance. You know, our profession, and for those of us who work in the public sector in the West, you know, our profession is tied to governance, local administration, the public administration. And when you have a kind of transparency or a meritocracy and a value assigned to architecture as civic spaces and a kind of sense of responsibility, then there's, you know, as an architect, you need that foundation. You need that foundation. And so, and that's something that we hear a lot, you know, in the beginning when we started working and started building and we would go on conferences and stuff, a lot of times, you know, we got comments like, and it was interesting, I mean, I find them interesting, saying, oh yeah, well in South Tyrol, you guys have a lot of money and so it's easy to do beautiful work. You know, of course, it's true, the times have changed, but you know, the province of Alto Adige had invested a lot of money in architecture. Why? Why? Because they invest in this kind of the schools, for example, schools are, you know, in the 1970s, I did this research, schools, they started investing and building in school buildings from the 1970s, because it was also a political statement, a form of a civic act. And these are all instruments that facilitate a kind of thriving architectural community. And these are all things that we're each responsible for holding our politicians to. We have to fight for that. Especially in this context of where we now know that change has to happen, we have to fight for our role in our role in shaping our physical environment, because that has an incredible impact on the larger environmental questions. But it's local, the administration of projects.
It's okay. The last comment altogether, it's about this idea. Our series of conferences is called Design the Future. The idea is that this period opens some possibilities and also needs to rethinking in some parts, uses, function, spaces, and so on. The question, my question is about also innovation in some parts. In some of your projects, you have said, I remember also we have discussed some years ago about your ideas in schools and education system. Sometimes as architect, as designer, we can give some ideas that we think they are innovative, they are fantastic because they are innovating also uses of space, but then maybe people cannot like it, or maybe there are some situation. So this moment we are also called to rethink the situation, but also to be in contact, in touch with the social ability to take into account our ideas. How can you feel it also? And I refer to comments by Giuseppe Baracchi, is the president of the Order of Architects, of the Council of Architects in Piacenza. He was following the conference, and he said, I know that they have also worked about maybe not a lucky story, the skate park in Bozen. The meaning is, it's possible that sometimes our projects are not well, are good, are innovative, but maybe the society is not ready to take them into account.
Yeah, I mean, innovation is it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So it's not it's a process, right? And sometimes you know, the thing about innovation is that innovation's a hard word, because it seems that what was in the past somehow was not innovative, and that's not true, right? I mean, a lot of things that are considered innovative, let's just say in school design, I mean, just look to Herzberger or so many other people, Giancarlo De Carlo, we're just, you know, repeating the same, doing the same things that they were working on. So innovation, I think it's really important that innovation is, it's not just about progress or breaking from the past. Innovation is a lot of different things. And so I'm getting a bit lost here, but what was the question about the skate park? That the skate park wasn't so, because for us, that was a really important project, the skate park.
Yeah.
Because the skate park, for those of you who don't know, we were called by the local municipal services, so the, you know, garbage collection and the electric services company. They needed, for a series of infrastructural reasons, they needed to put a cogeneration heating plant right smack in the middle of town. And so, of course, it was very inconvenient because it's an industrial building that has, you know, pipes and steam coming out of some skate park and put them in the industrial area and put the cogeneration plant in the middle of the town. And we said, why can't we have both, that the skaters are on top and the cogeneration plant is below? And at first it seemed completely crazy, but up until recently, now they've changed it, up until recently, that was the place to hang out.
Yeah.
So, and it wasn't because it was innovative and so new. I mean, a lot of buildings have these kind of hybrid programs that have nothing to do with each other, but just the way a building raises its head above the ground, it meets a program and you put them together and interesting things can happen, you know?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess we got, how is it, was your first experience with the online lecture?
I don't know. Without, you know, it's nice to see people and you can kind of understand, you know, who's listening, and, you know, if you're talking about something completely boring.
No, not definitely not. From our side was very interesting. Also, if you have time, you can read in the chat all the comments and thanking. It's a good way to be in touch and to build a community around the school, and this is the motivation of these cycles. I guess maybe Sara wants to say the last thanking and say hello. Sara, non ha il microfono.
I have the video but not the microphone. I want to thank really a lot for the lecture, because it was really important also for the approach of our master program. And I think, as you will see from the chat, the students have learned and have appreciated, and they enjoyed a lot your contribution. So I hope we will have other chances to meet again.
Yes.
And I thank you again, and I say hello to everyone.
I propose in Alpe di Siusi, if it's fine.
Yeah,
for you.
yeah.
Okay, which is better.
Yeah,
Much better, definitely. Okay.
Thank you so much for this occasion. I mean, it's so important to still get out there and meet new people. And teaching architecture in this condition, I think, is extremely challenging. And all the more pressing in these times where, you know, I think as architects, we're kind of called to arms and we have to really affect change, and change comes from education.
Yes.
So a big yes.
Thanks, we need it. It's really, really exhausting, I have to say. It's really hard now, so thanks a lot.
Okay, great to meet you. Thank you everyone for
Thank
listening
you.
in.
Okay, ciao.
Thank you very much. Ciao,
Ciao.
Sandy.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao.